Hi, this is Heidi Burgess, and today I want to talk about how to limit escalation and improve relationships by limiting us versus them language, thinking, and actions. Peter Coleman, who wrote the book The 5% about intractable conflicts, says intractability happens when the many different components of a conflict collapse together into one mass, into one very simple us versus them story that effectively resists change. And we tend to do that all the time. We tend to take whatever conflict we have and frame it as us being right and them being wrong. Us good, them bad. We're virtuous, they're evil. And it's very easy to do, and it's very pervasive. But what happens when we do that? Well, when we start thinking about the other as the enemy, we start treating them like the enemy. And they get angry about that, and most likely they're going to define you as the enemy and start treating you like the enemy. And that's going to make you angry, and that's going to start the escalation cycle, and this goes round and round. Now, in the escalation video, I showed lots of detail. And down in the lower left, you can see that the beginnings of escalation, the very first item, is outgroup identity. And look where it goes from there. It ratchets up to all sorts of escalation and polarization and interpersonal attack and unthinking anger and heightened emotions and hardening of stances of leaders and followers, and you get to the point where you change from wanting to do well to winning to where you just want to hurt the other, and you get to violence, and it keeps on going up and up and up. And it all starts down at the bottom with that outgroup identity, other imaging. So how do you stop this? Well, I find a very useful way to thinking about the problem is to reframe it from being on the other side of the table from your enemy to you both sitting on the same side of the table and being partners with an enemy who's on the other side, and the enemy is escalation. It's the escalation spiral. Well, what happens if you reverse things like that? If you start thinking of the other side as a partner, you're likely to start treating them with respect. You'll listen to them, you'll learn from them, you'll find common ground with them. And when you do that, they're likely to start treating you with respect, and you can turn that escalation upside down and start working together to solve common problems. First, you can solve the problem of escalation and polarization. Then you can start working together to solve the problems that you've been arguing about, like taxes, or immigration, or climate change. We can't solve those problems because we can't work with the other side who's blocking everything that we try to do. So reversing the escalation spiral by establishing working relationships with the other is absolutely essential. Well, how do we do that? Well, the first thing that conflict resolvers always talk about is active listening. And I'll add to that, be open to surprises. Don't assume you know what the other side thinks or why they think it. Now, I have this picture here because this is from our Thanksgiving dinner of a year ago. And I was having dinner with my son, who's forward on the right, and Guy is behind him, and at the back right is Sheila, who is Aaron's new wife, and everybody else is Sheila's family. And as you can probably tell, they're Indian. Most of them are immigrants, first-generation immigrants from India. And because they're immigrants, most of them are Democratic. But one of them isn't. One of them is a strong Trump supporter. And we got told before the guests arrived that we weren't supposed to talk about politics. I really wanted to talk to the Trump supporter and find out why. I don't understand. Why would an Indian immigrant support Trump? I wanted to learn, but I didn't have the opportunity to do so because I wasn't going to violate my host's request. Another thing we can do besides talk is we can read, and this is a really useful article in the U.S. version of The Guardian that suggests conservative journals and websites that are not far, far, far right, that will just anger liberals, but they're reasoned, they're thoughtful, and they have a lot that they can teach liberals about the other side. And the ones they talk about are Reason, the American Conservative, the American Magazine, which is Jesuit, and Tablet, which is Jewish. One of the quotes from this article I really like, it says, if the Trump administration is as authoritarian as some predict, this was written early on in Trump's term, progressives are going to need all the help they can get. To work with others, we may first need to acknowledge them, and learning about other perspectives is not the same as acceding to them. That's important. Just because you're listening to somebody else, just because you're paraphrasing to make sure you understand them, does not mean you're agreeing with them. But we cannot possibly work with them. We can't even effectively fight them if we don't understand where they're coming from. Another useful, very interesting article is this one written by Senator Orrin Hatch, a very conservative senator from Utah, who's been in the Senate a long time. He's retiring this year, who is very disturbed about the change in the lack of civility that he sees in the Senate and the nation overall. So he wrote this article a couple of years ago and said, our nation cannot continue on its current path. Either we remain passive observers to the problem, he's talking about the problem of incivility and polarization, or we endeavor to act to make the necessary changes in ourselves, in our families, and in our communities that will lead to a more civil, prosperous society. And Orrin Hatch, who is not exactly trained in conflict resolution, came up with 3 really good ideas of how to do this. First, speak responsibly. Refrain from dehumanizing, demeaning, or unfairly disparaging the other side. That's not an exact quote, but it's using his words. It's close to an exact quote. And then he went on to say, resist the impulse to frame every tiny policy disagreement as a zero-sum struggle for the soul of the country. Step 2. To better understand how the other side thinks and feels, we must make a conscious effort to diversify our media intake, to help us break free from party groupthink and be better prepared to engage in civil debate with friends and neighbors. Again, we need to listen, we need to read, we need to know why the other side thinks what it does. And lastly, expand our social circles. How can we expect to engage politically with members of the opposing party if we don't even interact socially with one another? In the spirit of civility, we would all do well to make friends with members of the opposing party. I speak from personal experience. And then much of the rest of the article talks about his close friendship with Ted Kennedy, who of course was a very liberal senator from Massachusetts. But Hatch and Kennedy were close friends for their entire Senate tenure. Going back to the notion of zero-sum framing, Guy often talks about the way that we frame conflicts as a football game, where all that matters is who is ahead and who scores, and every event is taken to mean one side scored a goal or the other side scored a goal, which is very similar to the ideas put forth in Lester Thoreau's book, The Zero-Sum Society. This just works to polarize us further and to frame the other side as the opponent, the enemy. So we need to avoid doing this, just like Guy and Orrin Hatch advised. Another thing to keep in mind is the idea that I presented earlier in another slideshow called the power strategy mix. And the idea here is that there's 4 types of people on the other side. There's persuadables, there's reluctant persuadables, where it's going to take more effort to persuade them, but it's possible. It's traitors who aren't really acting on principle, but if you give them something they want, they'll give you something you want. And then there's a group that we call incorrigibles. Now note, the boxes under persuadables, reluctant persuadables, and traitors are fairly thick, and the box under incorrigibles is thin. That's because there aren't very many of them. Most people on the other side in almost all conflicts are in one of the other 3 groups. Then the colors in those columns refer to power strategies or types of power. Red's coercive power, green is exchange power, and white is collaborative power. The power that you get from working with another person or the other side. Now, when you're working with persuadables, you should use mostly collaborative power because they're persuadable. They will collaborate with you if you just talk about that to them about principles and look for areas of common ground. With traders, you want to use mostly exchange power because they're ready to trade. You just need to figure out what they want and give that to them so you can get what you want, and that works. And with reluctant persuadables, you can use some trade and a lot of persuasion and maybe a little bit of coercion to push, but that's dangerous because coercion tends to make people angry. Save coercion for the incorrigibles because nothing else is going to work with them. But be careful of the fact that it's going to make them mad. So you've got to try everything else first, and to the extent that you can use collaborative power or exchange power, you're going to make partners out of these folks. You're going to get them on the same side of the table, working against the incorrigibles, working against the folks who are pushing the escalation spiral. Now, how do you do that? Well, the conflict resolution field has 2 approaches, or 3 depending on how you look at it, that they use a lot. I guess I'd call it 3. One is mediation or consensus building, where you get people on both sides to sit down with a mediator or facilitator who helps them actively listen and work out an agreement that's mutually acceptable. If that's not possible, we do dialogues where we get people to sit down together and just learn to understand each other better and to prepare the ground possibly for a later mediation or consensus building. The organization Essential Partners used to be called the Public Conversations Project, and they've been doing dialogue on contentious conflicts for a long, long time. They started on abortion and they've branched out from there. And they told me early on when I started to work with them a little bit that they never used the term common ground in their dialogues, because if they asked people to try to find common ground about abortion, nobody would ever come. So that's why they just get people to talk about why they are on the side of the conflict that they are, and to form better relationships. And at that, they have been very, very successful. I could tell you a lot more about it, but we don't have time, so I strongly suggest that you go to their website, which is whatisessential.org, and learn about them and look at their resources, one of which is a conversation guide for the red-blue divide. And this is useful for folks who are sitting down for Thanksgiving dinners and do want to engage with the people who are on the other side of the conflict. There is a way to do it without blowing up dinner, and Essential Partners can help you figure out how. Another thing that conflict resolvers do is either called problem-solving workshops, which was the term that John Burton used, who was one of the parents of the field who was profiled in this ESCAR Parents of the Field video, or Herb Coleman at Harvard used the term interactive problem solving. It's basically the same thing, and it's a lot like mediation, except instead of getting people to sit down and negotiate on the basis of interests, Coleman and Burton and Chris Mitchell and many others focus on human needs and argue that most intractable, or Burton called them, protracted needs-based conflicts were caused by the absence on one side or both sides of fundamental human needs. So mediation, dialogue, problem solving, they work very, very well with small groups of people. But here's the hitch. And that's orders of magnitude. Look at this chart. Mediation, basic mediation, works with 3 people. Consensus building might be 1 order of magnitude, or factor of 10 is what that term means, bigger than that, involving 30 people. But look how big a large city is. Look how big a large country is. The red-blue divide in the United States involves a country that has 300 million people. I actually don't know. I should know, but I don't know what the population is of the United States. But here we stuck with 3s to show that that is 8 orders of magnitude bigger than the 3-person triad. Now, to give you a sense of how big 8 orders of magnitude is, a person out for a stroll in the woods might walk 1.7 miles an hour. Slowly, but that's still a stroll. The space shuttle orbits the Earth at 17,000 miles an hour. That's only 4 orders of magnitude. We're talking about 8 or 9 orders of magnitude difference between the 3-person triad and the order of magnitude at which we need to be working. So it's not going to work to have lots of dialogues. It's not going to work to have lots of problem-solving workshops. We can't scale it up that much. We have to use a different approach. Well, what is that? Well, the most obvious one is the media. And this is a story about Search for Common Ground soap operas that they have been using in Africa and Bosnia and other places to try to get people to view the other as one of them instead of the other. And these have been very effective, which is why this article refers to them as subversive, because it changes people's attitudes about the other and gets them to see each other as friends as opposed to enemies. Related to this is the notion of peace journalism, which is defined here at peacejournalism.org when editors and reporters make choices of what to report and how to report it that create opportunities for society at large to consider and value nonviolent responses to conflict. I would add to that that creates opportunities for society at large to learn about and understand where the other side is coming from and why. Now, in addition to traditional media, there's social media. And we found out in the United States in 2016 how much influence social media can have. And we learned that these guys are really good at it. They were extremely successful in changing people's attitudes. They were extremely successful at driving hatred and polarization and fear and getting people who nobody thought would vote for Trump to indeed vote for Trump. The other side, the compromisers, the collaborators, need to get good at that too. In his post about coexisters versus fighters versus divide and conquerors, Guy had this slide. And he showed that there are people in the middle of both sides who want to work together constructively. They want to coexist. And there's a bunch of swing people. And then there's those incorrigibles on the far right and the far left, who he is calling fighters. And also, there's people who are what he calls power over, divide and conquerors. That's what these guys are. They have worked very hard to divide us from each other and get us to fight with each other and to completely disempower the constructive coexisting middle. So it's the constructive coexisting middle that needs to get good at social media too. That's actually what we're trying to do with our Conflict Frontiers seminar that we're sending out on Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn. And I'm glad to say we're reaching many thousands of people every month. But it's still a very small order of magnitude. And we need thousands, hundreds of thousands of people to be working with us to do this. Because all of the folks who are on the side of conflict resolution, all of the folks who are on the side of collaboration and respect, need to start working against the divide and conquerors and the fighters. And we need to start reframing the conflicts away from us versus them to we. Thanks.